Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about the transactional model of communication. So as you can see, this is built from the linear model, but again, these models of communication are designed to help us contextualize and understand the communication process. For all of you watching this, you know how to communicate. You've been doing it your entire lives. But for many of you, if not most of you, this might be the first time that you are applying that scientific rigor, that need to analyze and to understand how we are communicating. Not necessarily why, but how. What are the components of each individual communication event, every conversation, every text message, every time we interact with somebody? What are we doing to communicate, to create that shared meaning between one person and another? And how do we avoid miscommunication? So we talked about the linear model, which was sender, channel, and receiver, that really captured and understood how we were communicating or being communicated to via the television or via that one linear kind of direct model of communication. But remember, the idea there was that we were passive receivers, that we were just taking in that information. The transactional model builds upon that. So the linear model was kind of where we started. Many models went by, lots of years passed, lots of research, and then we got to the transactional model. Even after the transactional model, there are more models of communication that build from this, but I find that the transactional model does a really good job of capturing what's going on when we are communicating, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So if you're looking at the screen, you can see transactional model is made up of a number of different components. So we have the sender, the channel, and the receiver. This changes though, so we want to start thinking about the sender as being the communicator. This is the person or the entity within this environment who is communicating actively and purposefully with another group of people. So the communicator goes through this process that we call encoding. And that encoding is where we pick, if you remember we talked about language and the definition of language, we pick whatever symbols, whatever tools we want to use to try and create meaning. And then we encode those words, those symbols with meaning. And we're going to talk a lot more about this because right now it can be a lot. But what I want you to think about right now is that sender is now going to be considered the communicator, and they're going through a process of encoding. They are applying meaning. They're encoding their words with meaning. They're then going to send that through the channel. The channel doesn't change, but we add in the message. So now we're thinking about the channel and how that impacts the message. How does our message change based on the way that we are getting our message from the communicator to the receiver? We are going to communicate differently over text message than we would if we were having a conversation. We're going to communicate differently over Zoom or over a digital platform than we would if we were in a face-to-face environment in a classroom. We are going to communicate differently if we are emailing somebody versus if we were sending a letter. So that channel really comes into play here because that's going to impact the way that we create a message. It's going to directly impact the way the communicator is going to encode their symbols, whatever they're using to communicate. It's going to change the way they are encoding, and it's going to change the way this receiver is decoding. And this is where the receiver is translating those ideas, translating this message that they have received from the communicator. So as you can see, just with those basic concepts that we're already comfortable with from the linear model, we're building from that. It's becoming much more complex. So we have the sender, the channel, we have the sender who becomes a communicator who is encoding. We have the channel, which is how our message gets from point A to point B. We have the message itself. And when we're studying rhetoric, this is really what we're studying. We're breaking down that message and we are decoding, and we're coming to a more detailed and a more complex understanding of the message and what we can learn about the communicator through that. And then we have the receiver who is now tasked with decoding that message. They're translating that message and creating meaning. The receiver is interpreting that message and creating meaning. For those of you that speak multiple languages, I think that you have an inherent understanding about how this is an imperfect process. There are sometimes words that do not translate directly from one language to another. Well, that's the same when we are communicating. When we are the communicator, we have this idea about what we're trying to share, right? We want this other person, this other group of people to understand what we're trying to say, what we're trying to communicate to them. But because of that process of translation, we have an imperfect decoding process. So we have some miscommunication built into what we're doing. And for me, this is a key part of why communication is so important and why studying communication is so important. Moving on from these basic ideas, we have a couple of new concepts here. We have feedback and we have context. So this idea of feedback is very, very important because we started out with kind of a linear process. But then we start thinking about feedback and all of a sudden we have a circular process. And that's why we have these two-way arrows here. When communication scholars added in the feedback loop, which is what this is often called, we got a more detailed understanding of what's going on when we communicate, because we are now understanding that we're not just passive receivers. We're also communicating at the same time. We are simultaneously communicating, encoding, and receiving and decoding all at the same time. If we're having a conversation with each other, we're talking to each other, right? Or if we're in a face-to-face environment, a face-to-face classroom, and I'm doing this lecture, I'm speaking, right? I am encoding, I'm communicating, hopefully, with my students in the classroom, but also I am receiving. I am decoding their body language. I'm decoding the way my students look, facial expressions, eye contact. So I'm getting this feedback that is very, very important for the communication process, and I'm getting a more detailed, more complex understanding of whether or not that we are creating meaning here, whether my receivers are decoding and translating my message appropriately. So this feedback loop is very, very, very important. It's very important that you understand how the shift from a linear model to the transactional model really focuses on that feedback loop where we become simultaneously communicator and receiver. We are encoding and decoding at the same time. Following that, we have context. So again, if you think about the context of any environment where you're communicating or trying to communicate, it's going to be different everywhere that you're at. You're going to use different words. So you're going to be creating a different message. You're going to be using different channels. You're going to be encoding and decoding different things in different ways. So the context is really, really important. One way to really think about this is if you were trying to tell a story to a grandparent, you are going to tell that story differently than you would if you were talking to a friend. And that's just a shift in the receiver, which is part of the context. But also if you think about if you were at a job interview and you're asked a question that relates to that story is going to be different again, right? Because now the context is different. You are talking to somebody in a professional environment and you're going to tell that story differently. That message is going to change. The context is actually going to change everything about this, right? Because we're not communicating in the same way. We're no longer encoding our messages in the same way. The change in context is going to shift the channel. It's going to change how we're communicating, how our messages are getting from one point to another. The receiver is going to change. That's part of the context. And then also the feedback is going to change. So moving on from feedback and context, we get to noise. And this is one of the more interesting parts of this, at least for me. Because yes, we have all of this going on. It's a very complicated process. But then when the context changes, there's some other things that come into play. And that noise is anything that's going to inhibit our ability to get our message from the sender to the receiver. It's going to inhibit our ability to communicate. So anything that's making it harder for you to communicate, maybe you can't hear because you're in a loud room. Maybe you are trying to present your speech and they're doing construction outside of your classroom or outside of your house right now. That's going to change the way that you're communicating. It's going to change the way you're encoding. It's going to change the way your receiver is decoding. It's going to change the message, the context, and the feedback. So noise is really, really important. So we're going to talk about 4 different types of noise. First and foremost, we have physical noise. So physical noise is anything mechanical, any mechanical noise, like say somebody tapping their pen while you're trying to take an exam. That's infuriating. It drives people bananas. That is an example of physical noise. The example I gave just a moment ago about doing construction outside of your home or outside of your classroom while you're trying to present, that's going to be physical noise. Next, we have cultural noise. So this is going to come from a shift in language, a shift in worldview, a shift in values, a shift in the way that we communicate. So anything that might be considered culture or cultural can create noise. If you have people from two different cultures, they may communicate differently. So one of my favorite examples with this is actually space. Space is a very important factor when we are communicating with somebody. And if you pay attention to it, you might notice, well, right now, hopefully we're 6 feet away from everybody. But think about prior to COVID, how close you would stand to the people that you were comfortable with versus how far away you would stand from the people you weren't. This is something that we learn through our culture. What is an appropriate distance to engage with somebody that you don't know? If you think about if you were walking around campus and somebody wanted you to sign a petition, or walking around anywhere and somebody wants you to sign a petition, you start off at a pretty significant distance. And if you really want to do some research, you can actually find research about how close people stand based on how comfortable they are with each other. That's an entirely different thing, but we don't need to worry about it for public speaking. But cultural noise has to do with that perception of space. What's appropriate? When I was in community college, I was taking a psychology class, and we were talking about something related to this. And the professor had us do an activity where they had half the class stand up and go outside, and the other half stood up and waited by our desks. Professor goes outside, talks to the other students about something. We don't really know what, because I was inside. Students come back in and they just randomly start engaging the students that are in the classroom in a conversation. But what started happening is the students that were outside started closing that space, started getting closer and closer and closer to the people they were talking to. And the people who were in the classroom, like myself, we had no idea that that was going on. And so we're having this conversation, but this person is getting closer and closer and closer to you. I personally wasn't really bothered by that. I ended up being very close to the person I was talking to. But there were other people in the classroom that ended up moving up to 10 feet through the classroom. As this person got closer, they would take a step, and then the person who they were talking to would take a step backwards. And so they had this process where they're just moving farther and farther away. One person even sat down in a desk and turned the desk and put it between them to create some space. This is something that is learned through our cultural norms and our values. We communicate at different distances. So sometimes when you are, say, at the grocery store and somebody's too close to you and it's making you uncomfortable, that might not be them being rude. It just might be they learned to communicate in a different way, and they have a different perception of what is an okay distance to be close to somebody that you don't know. In America, in the United States, we are more individualistic. We like our space. We need a good amount of space. And if I'm remembering correctly, the research actually shows that people that we're not comfortable with, so strangers, we like to keep about 6 to 8 feet between us regardless of what's going on. So we have physical noise, which is going to be the tapping of a pen, a jackhammer, a dog barking, a neighbor shouting. We have cultural noise, which is going to be anything related to culture. So it could be language, it could be body language, eye contact, it could be distance, it could be gestures. There's a variety of different things that could relate to cultural noise. Next up, we have physiological noise. And physiological noise comes from our physiological processes. This is anything related to our body. So think about pain or hunger, or you've got an itch that you just can't scratch because you're taking an exam. Anything that's coming from our body is going to be physiological noise. Maybe you're really, really sore from a hard workout that you had and you just can't get comfortable in your chair that day. That is going to be physiological noise. That is going to create some kind of blockage, some kind of noise. It's going to make it harder for us to communicate. It's going to be harder for us to focus. Let's say if we're sitting in a desk in a classroom and we're very sore, we can't get comfortable in our seat, or we have maybe we hurt an ankle or a knee or our back, we can't get comfortable, right? So it's going to be harder for us to decode whatever message our sender is sending to us. And then because we can't get comfortable, we're moving, we maybe look unhappy, that feedback is going to get back to our communicator, and then we're going to have a different communication environment, a communicative event than we would have if you were comfortable and under perfect scenario or under perfect circumstances. So physiological noise comes from our body, and we have psychological noise, which comes from our mind. So this could be stress, anger, worry, happiness, sadness, anything psychological, any emotion that's coming from our brain. This is going to create some noise. It's going to inhibit our ability to actually communicate with each other because we can't focus. We're really, really excited about break. We're very nervous about a job interview we have coming up right after class. That's going to inhibit our ability to communicate effectively. So just a quick recap here before we move on to our last concept. We have feedback, which is the loop that created this circular process versus a linear process, where we are now communicator and receiver. We are simultaneously encoding and decoding a message. We have the channel, which is how our message gets from point A to point B. We have the message, which is the message itself, and that's going to be different depending on the channel we're using to communicate. We have context, which is the context of the environment is going to change the way we're communicating. We have 4 different types of noise: physical, tapping of a pen; cultural, be space; physiological, we're really, really hungry, we can't focus; psychological, we are nervous for a job interview after class, we're having a hard time focusing and communicating with a person or a classroom, or vice versa. Lastly, we have worldview. So how we communicate is going to be drastically changed by our worldview. So our worldview is literally, how do we view the world? And do we view it as maybe more optimistic or pessimistic? These things are our worldview is going to directly impact the way we do this, particularly with the message. If we are more pessimistic, we may use more negative language, and that could create kind of a negative communicative event that we didn't really mean to. Maybe we were just using more harsh language because that's what we do. What we'll find later on in this class when we start talking about language is that languages are inherently skewed by the worldview, or they can inherently skew our worldview. So there are some languages that use more aggressive, more abrasive language, and it's not meant to be mean or to be harmful to anybody else, but those languages are a little bit more abrasive versus others that are less abrasive, and we'll talk more about that. So overall, with the transactional model, we have hopefully a more detailed understanding of how we communicate. So the next time you're having a conversation with somebody, say this is you and this is somebody else, think about these things. Think about how you are encoding your message. How is your message getting from you to the other person? Are you texting? Are you conversing? Are you emailing? Are you on Zoom? Are you FaceTiming? And how does that change in channel impact the way that you are creating that message? How does it impact the way that you are decoding their messages? How does the feedback loop change things? How does it alter the way that you're communicating? If you were, say, arguing with somebody over text message, maybe you should be doing that in person. That's part of the feedback loop. We get more detailed communication when we can see somebody. How does the context change things? Again, are we upset with somebody? Are we at home? Are we comfortable? What types of noise are impacting our ability to communicate with this person? And then also, where does our worldview come into play? So the next time you're having a conversation with somebody, I really, really encourage you to pick a couple of things and just after the conversation is over, think about them. Think about what types of noise were at play, what about the context and the feedback, and I am certain that you will have a more detailed understanding of that conversation with that person, but also the communication process as a whole.